Good evening, everybody. My name is Jesse Carlson. I'm the Water Resources Manager here in the City of Savage. And I also have with me Terry Dill. She's a Senior Planner. And we're going to be presenting to you tonight information on the FEMA flood map update that's occurring in the City of Savage. So before I get into the presentation, I just want to go over a few just kind of things that we want to present in terms of how we're going to format this for this evening. First and foremost, you'll see on my screen I have this question and answer chat box up here. You should all have access to that box at the bottom of your screen. For me, it's up here, but for you all, I believe it's all on the bottom of your screen. So if you just kind of move your cursor down to the bottom of your screen, you should see the similar options that I have up here, where you can mute you don't have the ability to mute or unmute yourself for this, but this question and answer function should be available to you. So basically, we're going to be presenting the information first. And then once we're done presenting, we would like anybody who has questions or concerns that they want to bring up, is that you'd use this question and answer function, and we would entertain those questions at the end of the presentation. So there'll be open questions that'll pop up on here, answered questions, and then anything that we've potentially would have dismissed or maybe we'll answer later. One thing I will try to note is that if we are not able to get to your questions, you can always feel free to call Terry or I, or email after the presentations are over if something comes up later on as well. That's what we're here for. We want to help you out the best we can. Terry, do you want to add anything to that?
No, at the end, your last screen will have our contact information for anyone to contact us. And there's information also on our website.
Perfect. So the other thing too with the questions, as the questions are being answered, you do have the ability to like certain questions. So for instance, one question gets a bunch of likes, then we can try to make sure we answer that one first to make sure we get to all the questions as well. So with that said, I'm just going to kind of get into the presentation and we'll go from there. So again, my name is Jesse Carlson, Water Resource Manager in the City of Savage, and I should probably move that out of the way. Tonight I'll be presenting information on the FEMA floodplain map update, just kind of going over what changes are going to be occurring, why they're occurring, and how that might be affecting you. So a few things I'll be going over this evening is just an overview of the map update. I'll go over the National Flood Insurance Program. We're members of it and why we're members of it. How will the changes impact you and things that you can do to evaluate those closer. Talk a little bit about flood insurance and give you just some baseline information on flood insurance. And also go over some flood map tools that we have. The FEMA has a flood map viewer tool where you can look at your property and so on. The image here, oops. Just going to go over something real quick. The image I have on this, you can kind of see my mouse here. Sorry about that. The image here I have on the actual presentation, it kind of shows you the different flood areas. The areas adjacent to the river here, kind of known as your higher flood risk areas, or part of the special flood hazard flood areas, and part of the floodway. Areas that would be more medium risk would be kind of outside that typical area, more of like a 500-year flood zone, or 2% chance, I guess as FEMA would call it. And then areas, say like in between there, would be kind of a low flood risk, but I'll get into kind of more of that as we go through this. So why is the FEMA flood map occurring? Basically, if you can see here, the two little snapshots I provided, you can see the last study that was done in 1979, the original flood study that was done. And then our current study was done in 2011 and then was updated in 2018. And that's what's going to become effective here in 2021. With that change, there's 127 parcels that are newly affected, and then 83 that are no longer affected. the key thing with this is that, really the information that we have from when these originally were mapped to now is gotten better. We have better contour data, uh, better aerial imagery and so forth. So that the information just a lot more accurate. It's not like the flood elevation is necessarily changed per se. It's really just the information is more accurate. Talk a bit about the city role and what we have, and then things that we need to do on our end is we'll be adopting these flood maps and the ordinance by February 12th of 2021, so that we can maintain compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program, which allows everybody to obtain flood insurance. Little overview of the changes that we're seeing. I just got a few slides that kind of provide examples, and you should have all received a mailing that has these maps in them, and it shows you kind of the areas that are newly affected and then the areas that are no longer affected. So the areas in red, those parcels that we've highlighted are now affected by this flood map change. As you can see in this example, there's quite a few parcels that are impacted because of that flood map change. And then also there's some areas that as we went from, kind of existing conditions on the left to the new flood map, you can see this area is no longer in. And same on the left, you see the areas that were out and then the areas that are now in. So that's just one example there. Some other areas in the downtown Savage area, we have properties that weren't impacted previously, and then now they're being impacted. So on the left, areas that weren't basically are now being brought in. That's the red highlighted parcels, and then green being the out. And then lastly, our last example I just wanted to present, just to help clarify any questions on those maps. You can see on this map, for instance, on the left, previously this area, did not show up in the flood map area, and now it's newly in. You can just see a sliver there. There's some properties in this development here that are now going to be newly in. So if you're one of those property owners, you should give Terry or I a call in that instance. And just kind of giving you a general broad idea of kind of what those maps are representing and so on. So what is the city role when it comes to the FEMA process and the floodway and the flood maps? First and foremost, we are as the zoning authority. So as areas develop, we really want to make sure that the properties are, held out of the floodplain, and there's really at no risk or trying to minimizing those risks of flooding. So the image on the right, for instance, here, kind of generally shows you, as this area developed, these properties were basically not in the floodplain, and they were zoned that way, so they're not impacted by this flood change. One thing I want to just kind of call out as I'm going through the presentation, I have an area here that's identified in brown, the brownish color, as floodway. And that's really the area that really no structures could ever be placed in. And there's areas adjacent to that which are part of that special flood hazard area. And that's part of the floodplain or general floodplain. And really that 100-year flood elevation is how that's determined or based off of. And so any properties that are within that area potentially would be required to have flood insurance. Now, what I'll get into a little bit more is you might have a property, for instance, that's in the floodplain or has flood plain in your property, but if your structure's out, you potentially would not be required to obtain flood insurance. And there's options that kind of demonstrate some of that. The other role we have is, since we'll have an ordinance that make sure that these properties are out of that flood hazard area, is it allows us to make sure that we're in the National Flood Insurance Program, which allows then residents to obtain flood insurance. And the other role I believe the city role is to just really provide technical guidance to our residents when they're dealing with these issues and trying to understand what these flood map changes can mean for them. So I mentioned this a bit. One of the things that we do need to do is update our ordinance to make sure it conforms with the new flood map changes. So it really gets into the issues like, where structures are placed on properties with floodplain. It establishes certain flood districts. It also establishes requirements for low floor elevations. making sure that the low floors can't get impacted by a flood. It also identifies areas where, filling is prohibited. For instance, any properties that are within the lower Minnesota River Watershed District, which would be north of McCall Drive, essentially, those properties are in the lower Minnesota River Watershed District, and they do prohibit filling the floodplain. Whereas properties to the south of there, filling is allowed, providing it doesn't cause a rise or other issues with the floodplain. So just some nuances that are in the ordinance and so on. So how will the changes affect you as a homeowner? First and foremost, if you're identified as a property that, where the flood map now or floodplain is on your property and it affects the structure on your property, you would need to obtain flood insurance. But there are some provisions where potentially you believe as though, the floodplain is now on my property, but it's not going to impact my structure. So then you might need to take action to make sure that you're not needing to obtain that flood insurance. So you might be able to do a letter of map amendment, and I'll get into what that is. You also have the ability to do a letter of map revision if there was some filling done where you were able to elevate your property above that flood elevation. So this is just one example where an individual potentially could apply for a letter of map amendment. And in this example, I have a property here that's shown, and the structure is clearly out of the actual flood plain, but the property itself is in the floodplain. The property does touch the floodplain essentially. And so this property owner, we did work with them previously. So I was just kind of bringing this example up. Their lender contacted them and said, hey, you need to get flood insurance. But we were able to help this individual and demonstrate that they're actually out of the floodplain, and the structure at least is out of the floodplain. So they're out, they're basically out as shown is kind of how that works out. The other option would be if you actually have survey data. So when your home was constructed, if you have an as-built survey that shows your home is well above the flood elevation, then you would be able to demonstrate or show that or provide that to your lender, and typically they would accept that as well. So there's a couple options for a letter of map amendment. So if you're in that category and you have any questions, you probably want to reach out to us so we can assist with that. So another potential option where you wouldn't need, you would be able to demonstrate that you're out of the floodplain and would not need to obtain flood insurance is if your property was elevated based on fill, that would be a letter of map revision based on fill. So just an example I'm providing for everybody here in the presentation is the image on the left shows the current effective floodplain. It's not even close to the properties that are going to be developed, whereas a map on the right shows the updated flood map. And as you can see from this, I'm going to annotate this for everybody. You can kind of see this right here. Now it shows that those properties would be impacted. Now, what happened with this property or this area as it developed is, obviously with newer developments, they do a lot of mass grading, and they were able to fill this area and then elevate these properties above the flood elevation. So in this case, a LOMAR or letter of map revision based on fill would apply, and the actual developer is going through that process as we speak. So you might be existing property, for instance, where maybe it was elevated based on fill that's now impacted, so you might be able to demonstrate that as a part of this as well. So, if you're in this case, I would definitely suggest you reach out to us as well on that one. I'll talk a little bit about flood insurance. Actually, I'll have Terry kind of talk about this, but one example I'd give you is so if you're somebody who has, you're not in the floodplain, you still have the option to obtain flood insurance. Your rate would be a lot lower. And I'll just give you an example of myself. I had a bit of a flooding issue in my basement because water backed up in my backyard, just due to snow melt. And I did have flooding in my basement. If I would have had flood insurance, I would have been covered, but I did not. So again, you always have the ability to obtain flood insurance, even if you're not in the flood area. So I'll let Terry talk a bit about just a little bit about the flood insurance information.
So I just want to explain, most of you probably got a letter in the mail from me regarding some of the different scenarios that you may be in. I laid out 3 scenarios, and depending on which one you're in may depend on what will be required for flood insurance. So you can always contact us if you have questions about specifically if your structure itself is in the flood zone or if just a part of your property is. So all properties that have a federally backed mortgage are required to have flood insurance. So you may get a letter in the mail from your lender noting that you are going to have to start carrying flood insurance. That will only be required if your structure itself is in the floodplain. And we can look those properties up for you specifically. We also sent letters to property owners whose property is, a portion of your property is in the floodplain, but your structure itself is not. Some of you may get a letter from your lender that you'll be required to carry flood insurance, but you may not be required to. Lenders actually can get in trouble if they do not properly require the flood insurance. So in some of those scenarios, and Jesse and I have helped homeowners with this quite often, we can just write a letter showing on an aerial map where your property is and where the floodplain is in relation to where your actual structure is. So if your structure itself is not in the flood zone, then you would not be required to have flood insurance. So if you do believe that your structure is now in a flood zone, I suggest you contact your insurance agent right away. There are some programs where you can get in with flood insurance at it's kind of a step increases. You wouldn't have the full cost of full flood insurance right away, but you would need to act on that sooner than later. To get flood insurance, you can contact your insurance agent. Not all insurance agents sell flood insurance. Majority of the larger companies do. If yours does not, you can always contact us. We can help you with getting some resources, but also floodsmart.gov provides a lot of information on FEMA's website about purchasing flood insurance. We do have all those links are on our website too. And additional information also is on the preferred risk policy. And that's where if you previously were not in and your home was structured and it's in compliance, it was in compliance with all the floodplain regulations, and you would be able to participate in that program where there's a step increases for flood insurance. With that, if you want to know exactly where your property, if you could not tell on the map that was included in your letter, we can look up each of your properties for you. And we can provide additional information on flood insurance too. I just wanted to also mention, again, if you have any questions, you can write your questions now in the question and answer section at the bottom of the screen, and then we'll answer them at the end of the presentation.
Perfect. Thanks, Terry. I want to go over, we did provide some information on our website and in the letter, really going over some flood map resources. FEMA has a flood map changes viewer where you can actually click on your property and it'll show you the change in the floodplain change itself. It'll bring them up side by side. So that's a great tool to use. There's a FEMA Flood Map Service Center where you can, enter your address and it'll bring you to your property and show you where the floodplain is on your property. We also have a local resource here available through the Scott County GIS, and it does bring up a lot of great information. I'm actually going to demonstrate that tool for you guys real quick here. Let's see. So here's that Scott County GIS tool that I mentioned previously. What you would want to do is just go to Google and just say Scott County GIS. And once you get to this web page right here, click on Scott County SG3 essentially, and it brings up this web mapping tool. We use it quite a bit here at the city, and it's got a lot of really great information. So then you would just, for instance, you know your address. I'm just going to type in an address that I know here in the city of Savage.
Jesse, we actually just got a question on a certain address. I don't know if you want to use that as an example.
Sure, I can do that. What's the
Can you do 15070 Bridgewater Drive?
Here we have a property in the city of Savage. I'm going to turn on some of the layers that I want to use. So on the left-hand side, you can see all the different layers available. For the floodplain layers, essentially what you go to this arrow, you want to click on it and it'll bring a down arrow. And then you want to click on the preliminary floodplain. That's really what we're concerned about moving forward. I also like to use the aerial photography that's available to us, it really clearly shows the structure typically. Actually, I'm going to use it 2019. It has leaf off. So for this property in particular, you could, for instance, get a letter from your lender saying, you know, this flood map changes affects your property, and now you need to purchase flood insurance. However, when reviewing the actual photo, aerial photo here and the actual flood map boundary, it appears as though the structure is out of the floodplain, and that's something the city could assist you with in terms of, you know, writing a letter, providing a map that shows that for you. I'm just curious what the current effective flood boundary is on the property. So as you can see, this is a great example where the current effective floodplain that is currently, your property is currently regulated under does not even impact the property at all. So I could see the lender reaching out to you saying, yep, you're in it now. You need to get flood insurance. And then you would be able to respond and say, no, we're actually, the structure's out, and we can assist with that process. Terry, do you have anything else you would want to say on that?
Nope, I think they were just inquiring on where their actual property was, or if
Okay.
the structure itself was in the floodplain. So
there you go. That's one tool we use here in the city of Savage. DNR has a lot of great information on their website, and we provided links to this on our website. And it has just some general information for homeowners. You know, how can I view my flood area? You got maps. You know, what if I just been recently mapped into this special flood hazard area? So there's kind of this drop down here, and it gives you just general information. What if you believe you've been inadvertently concluded? This is another kind of, I went over some of those examples of what you can do to kind of demonstrate that you're actually out. So there, again, DNR has a lot of great resources, and I would suggest you take a look at those as well. So this here, providing it, we've been having some issues with this FEMA flood map changes viewer, but I do want to just kind of try to use it real quick. This is another great tool where it kind of gives you that side-by-side comparison. Oops, if I can actually get to the right spot. Let's see, 1, 4, 2, 9. Oops, I just had it. Well, here's a property in the city of Savage. You gotta click on the pin. Click on the property, hit run. And it should provide an output. It kind of shows you that side-by-side comparison. And we've been having this issue throughout the day, but what it's supposed to do is basically provide you a side-by-side comparison of your property with the current flood plain and then the new changes. So I would suggest using that tool, just that we've been, like I say, we've been having some issues with it for whatever reason. So those are some of the resources, I guess, you have available here in the city of Savage. Another slide I have is just kind of go over just some resources again that I kind of already talked about, but this is the information that's available on our website. It has both Terry and my contact information. It talks about the webinar, but it also has these helpful websites right here. It has that FEMA flood map changes viewer, the DNR's information on flood map updates, that FEMA letter of map amendment or revision process that I kind of talked about with the LOMAR and LOMARs previously, and also the National Flood Insurance Program as well. So there's some resources available for you on our website. With that said, I'm going to open it up for the question and answer session. Our contact information is available here as well in case you wanted to write that down and give us a phone call, send us an email and such. So with that said, we'll start looking at the question and answers, and we'll go through those.
Do you want me to go through those, Jesse?
Yeah, I think that would be helpful.
So we answered the first question about the specific address. Another question we got is, if our structure is out of the floodplain, do we need to fill out any other forms? And the answer to that is no, you don't. We still sent you the letter just in case a lender would contact you to get flood insurance. We just wanted you to be aware that you may not be required to carry it. So if you do not get a letter and you are not in a flood hazard area, that's a key thing. If you know your structure is not in the flood hazard area, you don't need to do anything. But if a lender contacts you, we can help you with providing a letter on city letterhead that has the aerial maps and it shows your structure versus where the floodplain is. A lot of times that will help satisfy the requirement, and then you would not be required to carry that flood insurance. So you can contact us and we can help you with that. Yeah, and the second part of that question was in order to update any maps to avoid future issues. So the floodplain is still on your property. The key thing is the structure, but you would not need to update or go through any process to change the maps if the floodplain is just shown in your yard area. That wouldn't be a requirement. The next question is, I think my structure is outside the floodplain. Should I wait for a note from my lender before working with you on gathering details, or should I do it now? Like I said, I would just wait until you get a letter if you know for sure your structure is out. And then another question was, we tried using that tool and never had any luck. And I believe that is referring to the FEMA flood map changer. And we've had the same issues. And I know the DNR has contacted FEMA about fixing it. That technically is the only map option out there that shows the comparisons. You can go on Scott County's website, like Jesse did a presentation on, to look at the different, the existing floodplain and the proposed to be adopted in February. And if you can't, we can also look that up and send you a map too, showing those differences. And then the next question is, do all of the new home construction near the floodway have an impact on where the water can be displaced? Is this a cause of floodplain changes over time? So I don't know if you want to answer that one, Jesse, about the displacement. Maybe a little bit of background too is that the flood maps, the ones that we had previously were very old, and the new maps are using better data and technology. So it's not that any of the home construction is having an effect on our maps. This was just new information that is better quality in order to create better and more accurate mapping.
So that's one of the things.
That.
Yeah, so and that's definitely something that is a part of new home construction. You know, it's something that does get looked at, and if there's any impacts in the floodplain over time, we want to make sure that those aren't causing a rise in the flood elevation. So typically, we as a zoning authority, the goal is to always develop in a way that wouldn't cause that to happen. So we try to place structures outside the actual floodplain so they won't have that impact. So I think in the upper watershed or South Savage, that's been done and shouldn't be having that impact. Whereas in the older parts of Savage, those types of issues maybe weren't looked at as closely, back in the 60s and 70s when a lot of those areas were developed. So over time, yeah, certainly there could be some impacts, but really with the newer development, that's something that, you're really not allowed to fill in the floodplain. There is some filling that would be allowed, but it has to be done in a way that wouldn't cause a rise in the flood elevation. So there is really no impact. Where we see bigger changes and where we're really required to evaluate this is where culverts get installed, say across the river, and that has to be evaluated. And there's a lot of modeling or hydraulic modeling that goes into that to demonstrate then to um, DNR and FEMA that we're not creating a rise in the flood elevation. So that's where bigger issues do come into play, is really crossings typically, but not so much from development.
I think that is all of the answers or questions, I'm sorry.
So I think, the big thing is if you still have a question and would rather just give us a call or send us an email, don't hesitate to do that. We're available to answer these questions offline as well. So we'd love to do that if we need to.